But we try to preserve life as human beings. And so, going back to his father's house, Jacob encountered an obstacle. And so he sent his messengers before him. But before we even get to the point where he sends his messengers, he recognizes that the angels of the Lord are with him. And so he says, this is God's host. And we see that the stage is being set for a battle. For he called this place Mahanaim, which is the place of two camps. So we see that the stage is getting set for a battle. And so Jacob sends his messengers to Esau. And he says, maybe if I just send my messengers ahead of time, maybe they can appease him. Maybe they can kind of talk Esau down and calm him down. Because, after 20 years, I don't know if he's still feeling hot under the collar. After 20 years, I don't know if he's still trying to kill me. So let me just scope out the situation. And so when the messengers come back and say, Esau has 400 men with him, coming to meet you, Jacob knew this was no regular welcoming party. And so Jacob starts to go into high gear and starts to think, okay, what can I do to ease my brother's hatred towards me? What can I do to turn him away from trying to kill me? And as it were, Jacob comes and he decides, the Bible says he was greatly afraid and distressed. In other words, Jacob was freaking out. Why? Because this roadblock wasn't something that he wanted to encounter, wasn't something that he wanted to have to deal with. He just wanted to go back to his father's house. But the Lord had promised him that he would go back in peace. And so Jacob starts freaking out and he says, listen, I got to do something. So let me send ahead these gifts. And then Jacob starts to pray. He says, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, the Lord which says unto me, return unto thy country and to thy kindred, and I will deal well with thee. Jacob starts to pray and said, Lord, you promised that you'd bring me back to my father's house in peace. This does not look like a peaceful situation. This does not look like what you promised. This doesn't look like what I agreed to. For I said, if you bring me back in peace, and you give me all these things that I need, the food that I need and the raiment that I need, then will I serve you, and then will you be my God. But this so far does not look like peace. So what is going on? Lord, you need to deliver me. But notice that the Lord never answered Jacob. Notice that there's no response. Prayer is not complete until the God that you pray to answers back. Amen. And so Jacob was left dangling here. And before he could even get a response, he puts his plan into action. He sends ahead the troops, and he said, listen, the droves, he says, listen, when you come to my brother, man, he inquires of you and says, who are you and what are these with you? Make sure you tell him that it's from me, his servant, Jacob. Make sure you tell him. So Jacob is strategizing. Jacob is trying to find a way out of his situation because he's desperate. He's trying to find a way out of his situation because he doesn't want to deal with the obstacle that is to come. He doesn't want to face his brother who is looking to kill him. He doesn't want to face the one who drove him out of his father's house to begin with. And if I'm being very particular and repeating certain things, it's because I want us to get it today. Jacob did not want to face his brother that was looking to kill him. It was the very situation that set him out of his father's house, where Jacob didn't want to face him. Jacob didn't want to come to him, and so he prayed and used every trick that he could to get out and to appease his brother. He did everything he could to kind of cover the fact that the reason that his brother wanted to kill him is because he swindled him out of his blessing. Now, if you've been in a newcomers class, you know that it was the will of the Lord that Jacob received that blessing. But from Esau's perspective, it was his. Yes. And Jacob stole it. Mm-hmm. And that's why Esau wanted to kill him. Yes. So Jacob is looking at the situation. He's looking at everything. He said, listen, I've got to fix this. I've got to do something about this. I don't want to face Esau. So he asked the Lord to deliver him. He said, listen, Lord, you can't let Esau smite the child on the breast and all of us. For this is my posterity. This is a blessing that you said you'd give me.
And he didn't make us like robots. He gave us a choice.
And so he lodged in the place where he was that night. And the droves continued ahead in their march. And the Bible tells us, it goes on to specify all the great gifts that he gave to Esau. This is all part of Jacob's strategy to not have to face his brother. and face the wrath that he believed was to come. But what Jacob didn't realize is that it wasn't his brother that he was fighting against. It wasn't his brother that he was fighting against. But as he sent on the droves and eventually sent on his wives and his children, the battle becomes more clear. It becomes more obvious that this fight is not between Jacob and Esau, but between Jacob's will and the Lord's will. Because as he wrestled with the angel, he sent ahead his wife and his children and sent everyone so that he was alone. And there came the real wrestling match. There came the real fight. There came the real battle. As the day broke, Jacob wrestled with that angel. But see, Jacob was strong. See, one thing we've been learning about Jacob is that he's determined. And so he fought with vigor. He fought a fierce fight. And when the angel saw that he continued to prevail, the angel took his thigh and broke Jacob. And when Jacob was broken, so was his will. And then instead of trying to do things for himself, Jacob's demeanor changes. And in the changing, in the breaking, the angel asked him a question. The angel said to him, "What is thy name?" What is thy name? As Jacob was wrestling against the angel, after he was broken, he asked for a blessing. He said, "I'm not letting go of you until you bless me." And the angel said, "What is thy name?" Now, at this point, Jacob could have done one of two things. He could have lied. He could have covered it up. Because his name meant just that. His name meant deceiver. His name meant trickster. His name meant one who supplants, and not in a good way. Jacob could have given into the covering, given into his moniker and covered up the fact that he was a deceiver and he was a trickster. But Jacob, in the single solitary moment of mentioning who he was, Jacob declared the truth of his demeanor. Jacob, in issuing and saying clearly that my name is Jacob. In fact, he couldn't even muster up my name is. All he could say is Jacob. All he could say is deceiver. All he could say is trickster. All he could say is supplanter. When the angel was asking, "What is thy name?" he was asking, "Who are you?" He was asking him, "Who are you?" See, Jacob wanted a blessing. Jacob wanted something from this angel. But in order for Jacob to receive what it was that he wanted, he had to come face to face with who he was. You see, Jacob hadn't even come back to his father's house yet. He hadn't made it back down the road to his father's house, to that place where he first had an encounter with God. But before he could even get back to that place where he had the encounter, he first had to come face to face with who he is. He first had to recognize and admit to the fact that he was a supplanter. He first had to admit to the fact that he was a deceiver and a supplanter and a trickster and all these things that he had been. But the angel doesn't leave the discourse at that. The angel goes on to say, "And thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel, for as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. In other words, what the angel was saying, good, you've admitted who you are. Now you can move forward. Now, from this point, you're not going to be known because you were able to come face to face with that which you tried to cover, that which you tried to hide, that which you didn't want to acknowledge. Because you were able to come face to face with this reality and be honest, now you can move forward. But what I want you to recognize is that he said, thy name shall be called no more Jacob. In other words, his name hadn't changed quite yet. But all that was done was that now Jacob had passed this roadblock that was in the middle of the way. He had passed the checkpoint, if you will, to be able to continue to get to his father's house. You see, there was a goal, and this is just a pathway to get to a goal. But in order to be able to progress down the pathway, there are checkpoints that we've got to pass. And this was a point for Jacob. In order for him to be able to go forward, he had to recognize who he was. Now it seems like a simple fact just to admit who we are. It seems so simple just to say, listen, this is who I am. But in reality, it's a difficult thing to look in the mirror and to confess who we are.
Yes.
See, human nature is such that when a man has been traumatized, or when a man does wrong, or a man is responsible for something, a man doesn't like to confess, doesn't want to take blame. You notice it with children that when someone has done something and you ask, okay, who's responsible for this? They all point at somebody else. She did it. He did it. It's always somebody else's fault. Why? Because human beings, we like to justify ourselves. We like to say that, you know what? It's not my fault. This person made me do it, or somebody else made me do it. If I'm like this, it's because my parents didn't treat me well, or it's because, I was abused as a child, or because these people influenced me in a negative way, and that's the reason that I am the way that I am. We don't like to confess the fact that we have evil ways of ourselves. We don't like to confess the fact that we are capable of doing the unthinkable. We don't like to confess the fact that we can be backbiters, because we know that backbiting is wrong. We know that we ought not to do that. We don't like to confess that we have been responsible for bringing down our brothers and sisters with our bad attitudes, because we know that we shouldn't do that. We don't like to confess these things. Why? Because we don't want to take responsibility. We don't want to own up to who we are. We don't want to face who we are. Why? Because facing who we are is painful. Facing who we are is a situation that we don't want to do, because it reminds us of all the things we've done. Reminds us of the people that we've hurt. It reminds us of a destructive behavior that we've caused. Whenever there's a traumatic experience, human nature is to run away or to stay away from the place where the trauma has occurred. Because when we come back to the trauma, where we see the physical signs, when we go back down the road for where this trauma has happened, as we start to get closer, we see the markers, we see the signs, and they remind us of what has happened. I tell the story often because it's something that's so marked to me. I remember my brother was 8 years old when our father died. And I remember my brother at the time, he was 8 years old, and so as an 8-year-old mind wasn't truly able to comprehend what that meant. He, with the wisdom of an 8-year-old, he comforted my mother and said, "Don't worry, Mommy, we'll see Daddy in heaven someday." But yet, the gravity of the situation hadn't really sunken in, hadn't really been dealt with. So that years after, this young man struggled because his father wasn't around. But you see, the problem is, and I find this especially in certain communities, we don't like to talk about things that have happened.